There are songs Sam Cooke recorded. There are songs he performed. Songs that audiences knew before he opened his mouth to sing them. Songs that filled rooms the moment the first note arrived. Songs that people carried home afterward and heard again in their own kitchens and cars in the weeks that followed. And then there are songs that existed only once, in the dark, on a moving bus, with almost no one listening. Those are the songs nobody ever heard again. This story is about one of them. To understand what it means for a song to exist this way, unrehearsed, unrecorded, heard by no one who was supposed to hear it, you have to understand what the hours between performances actually looked like for Sam Cooke and the musicians who traveled with him. Touring in the early 1960s at the level Cooke was working meant a particular kind of life that had very little to do with the life visible from the outside. From the outside, it looked like stages and spotlights and the response of large rooms to a voice that had learned exactly how to move them. It looked like success, continuous and effortless. A series of arrivals in cities where the name on the marquee meant something, where the dressing room was already prepared, where people had been anticipating the evening for weeks. What it looked like from the inside was a tour bus at 2 a.m, somewhere between one city and the next, on a highway that went through places that weren't on anyone's itinerary. It looked like the particular silence of a vehicle full of people who were too tired to sleep deeply and too exhausted to stay fully awake. A half-silence, the kind that settles in after a show, when the energy of the performance is drained out and what remains is the body's honest accounting of what the night has cost it. The band sprawled across seats in the positions they had each worked out over months of this same journey. The driver's hands steady on the wheel. The landscape outside, if anyone was watching it, offering nothing that distinguished one stretch of highway from another. The musicians who worked with Cooke in this period understood these rhythms intuitively, because they were living the same rhythms. A touring band in the early 1960s moved through the world in a particular kind of shared solitude, together constantly, in the same vehicles, in the same backstage rooms, in the same diners at the same hours, and yet each person largely alone in the way that matters, inside their own accounting of what the work was costing them. There was a kind of etiquette to it, unspoken and almost never discussed, about when to talk and when to leave silence alone. The bus at 2 a.m. was silence territory. You moved quietly. You kept what was yours to yourself. Sam Cooke, by the accounts of people who made this journey alongside him, was not always easy to read in these hours. He could be talkative, warm, funny. The same quality that made him easy in a room with strangers carried over into the back of a bus with people he had known for years. But he could also be quiet in a way that wasn't unfriendly exactly, but that was complete, the way a door is complete when it's closed, not locked, but clearly shut. After certain shows, something in him would turn inward, and the people around him had learned to recognize it and give it space. On those nights, the hours between cities were his own. The guitar was a constant on the bus, the way certain objects become constants in a traveling life, not because they're always used, but because their presence is reassuring in the way that familiar things are reassuring when everything around you is temporary. It lived in a case that fit in the luggage hold or under a seat, depending on the night. And Cooke would take it out sometimes, in the same quiet way he did most things, without announcement, without making it an event. He played differently when he wasn't performing, differently than in rehearsal, differently than on records. What came out of the instrument in those unscheduled moments was something more tentative than his public playing, more searching, closer to the way a person thinks out loud than to the way a person speaks for an audience. On this particular night, somewhere in the early years of the decade, on a highway that could have been in any one of a dozen states, most of the bus had been asleep for an hour or more when Cooke reached for the guitar. He tuned it quietly, the way he always did, by ear, making the adjustments with a patience that suggested he was in no particular hurry to get to whatever was coming next. The bus moved. The engine held its steady register. Outside, the dark was the particular dark of a highway at that hour. Not empty, but indifferent. The occasional light from a distant building passing and disappearing before it fully registered. What he started playing wasn't anything anyone in the band would have recognized. It wasn't a song from the set. It wasn't a gospel standard or a pop structure he had been working on. It had the shape of something being found rather than something being played from memory. A melody that appeared in one form, then shifted slightly, then settled into something closer to what it seemed to want to be, then shifted again. Not a composition in progress, something earlier than that. The sound of a person following a feeling through music before the feeling has any name yet. One of the musicians further back in the bus came partway awake at some point during this. Not sharply, not with any particular reason for the timing, but in the way that sleep interrupts itself on long journeys for no reason anyone can explain. He heard the guitar before he was fully conscious of where he was. For a moment he simply listened, the way you listen to something when you don't yet have the context to understand what you're hearing. When the context arrived, when he understood that what he was hearing was Sam Cooke playing alone, in the dark, on a moving bus, he made a decision that he later described as instinctive. He stayed still. He didn't shift in his seat. He didn't open his eyes any further than they already were. He simply became as close to absence as a person can be while still being present. And he listened. What he heard, for the next several minutes, was something he spent years trying to describe and never quite found the right words for. Not because the music was technically extraordinary, it wasn't performed music, and it didn't carry the precision or the assurance of Cooke's stage work. What made it difficult to describe was something else, the quality of exposure it had. Cooke's playing in that hour had the character of something done without an audience in mind, and the absence of that intention, the total absence of performance, gave it a texture that was wholly different from anything the musician had heard Cooke do in any formal context. It was, in the most literal sense, music made for no one, or music made for the road, for the dark, for the particular state a person enters when exhaustion and solitude combine and the ordinary controls of public life stop operating. The melody kept moving. Sometimes it approached something that sounded almost like a song, something with a shape that, if it had been developed, might have had words, might have had a structure that a producer could have worked with. And then it would drift away from that shape, loosen into something more ambient, more like thinking than like composing. There were moments when the playing stopped entirely for several seconds, not because Cooke had finished with whatever he was doing, but because the silence was apparently part of it too, part of the same process, the music and the quiet alternating the way breath alternates, neither one complete without the other. The musician in the back of the bus lay still and watched the dark through the window and heard it all, heard the playing and the stopping and the small adjustments Cooke made when a phrase didn't go where he seemed to want it, heard the way the melody kept returning to something that felt almost like a center without ever quite settling there. Eventually it stopped. Not abruptly, it tapered, the way things taper when a person runs out of something rather than deciding to end it. Cooke sat with the guitar for a moment after the last note, then put it back in the case. He settled into his seat. Within a few minutes, the quality of his breathing changed in the way that breathing changes when a person finally goes to sleep. The musician in the back of the bus lay awake for a while longer. He didn't move. He didn't speak. There was no one to speak to, and nothing to say that would have improved on the silence that had closed over the last hour. In the morning, when the bus pulled into the next city and everyone began the business of checking in and finding food and preparing for another night's work, nothing was said about it. He didn't mention it to Cooke, and he didn't mention it to anyone else on the bus. He kept it the way you keep things that feel private, in a way that has nothing to do with secrecy. Private because sharing them would change what they were, would make them into stories when what they actually were was something more direct than a story. For Sam Cooke, as far as anyone could tell, that night was simply a night on the road, one of hundreds. What he had played in those unscheduled hours wasn't a song he mentioned, wasn't something he returned to, wasn't the beginning of anything that ever showed up in a studio or on a stage. It belonged to the dark and the highway and the 2 in the morning hour, and when that hour ended, it ended with it. But the musician who had lain still in the back of the bus carried it with him for the rest of his life. Not as a memory of something specific, not a melody he could have hummed back, not words he could have written down, but as a sense of having witnessed something that existed entirely outside the frame of everything else he knew about Sam Cooke. Outside the performances, outside the records, outside the reputation that had accumulated around a voice that millions of people felt they knew because they had heard it so many times. What he had heard that night was the part of Cooke that the voice never quite conveyed. Not because the voice couldn't carry it, but because music that's made for an audience is always, by definition, shaped for an audience. Even the most honest performance is a performance. Even the most unguarded song, once it's recorded, has been committed to a form. What exists before any of that? What moves through a person in the dark, on a moving bus, with no one watching and no reason to make it anything other than what it is something that almost never survives the morning. What the musician understood in the years after that night was that the audiences who had seen Sam Cooke at his best, who had stood in theaters and watched him hold a room with what seemed like effortless ease, had seen something real and extraordinary. But they had seen the shaped version, the version that had been carried through the discipline of a performer who understood exactly what a room required of him. What existed before the shaping, in the hours the audiences never saw, was something the discipline was built on top of, something that had no name and no form, and that survived only long enough to travel from a guitar to the ears of one half-sleeping musician on a moving bus, and then disappear into the dark, the way everything disappears that was never meant to last. On that night, on that highway, it survived just long enough for one person to hear it, and then it was gone. That is the only version of that song that will ever exist. It lasted until the guitar went back into its case and Sam Cooke went to sleep. And somewhere between one city and the next, it became the kind of thing that can't be recovered. Not because it was lost, but because it was never meant to be found.